Hello and welcome back to my channel where I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in April. And once again, I was able to get through 22 books. It was a bit of a shifting around of things on my list by the end of the month to make sure that I could make that happen. But I'm going to share the 22 books that I read, starting in the order that I read them. So I started the month with a couple of mystery novels. These were very fast reads. I started with Alifair Burke's Find Me, and I have read Alifair Burke a few different times. She has a detective series, and in this particular book, there's a main character who has lost her identity, kind of lost her memory, and then she goes missing, and we're trying to figure out the past history of this character, what happened to her, why she went missing, and she has a best friend who's kind of trying to track her down. And full of twists and turns, as a good Alifair Burke usually has. I really enjoyed it. So first one was Find Me by Alifair Burke. Then I read The Night Shift by Alex Finlay, and I had read another book by Alex Finlay, which I also really enjoyed. These books are typically fast-paced thrillers, and this one was no different. So you have a couple of different crimes that have happened about 15 years apart. Both of them take place in a kind of hangout for teens where there's a bunch of teen workers and they are killed as a group. And we're trying to figure out the connection between the first time this happens and the second time this happens. And hence the name The Night Shift, because all of these teenagers are on the night shift. And I love a good thriller that has like a cold case element and a modern day contemporary element. So this was right up my alley. Next, I switched over to several nonfiction books, and this was something that I was really interested in for this month because I felt like I had moved away from nonfiction and I wasn't reading a lot of nonfiction, so I wanted to read more in April. So I started with Seth Godin's The Practice, which is a book of kind of short essays about what he calls shipping creative work, which is basically how do you get your creative work out into the world. I find Seth Godin's work to be full of wisdom. I mean, it's relatively a quick read, but I walked away thinking about a lot of different kinds of things, both for my creative work, for the work that I do for my day job. I always find his work to be very inspiring. Seth Godin is known as kind of an online marketing guru, and so he has a lot of different books on a lot of different topics, but this one is one of his latest, and I really was glad that I picked it up. Then I switched over to The Collaborative Habit by Twyla Tharp. Twyla Tharp, if you're not familiar with her work, is a choreographer, and she has a wonderful book called The Creative Habit, which I have loved and often recommend. And this was a more recent book that she wrote on collaboration. And basically it's kind of her lessons that she's learned over time, collaborating with a range of different artists, musicians, other choreographers, dancers. And what I always appreciate about Twyla Tharp's work is that even though she has a pretty niche field that she works within, the lessons that she's talking about are broad-ranging and applicable to a range of other fields as well. So this one was really fun also to kind of revisit the life and the stories of Twyla Tharp in addition to getting these life lessons. Then I read a book called But You're Still So Young by Kayleen Schaefer. And the subtitle for this book is How 30-Somethings Are Redefining Adulthood. And basically what this book is pointing out is that there were these expectations of what people would do to enter into adulthood. Things like finishing school, buying a house, getting married, having kids. And there are a lot of 30-somethings that have not done many of those things. And so what does it mean for the concept of adulthood that there are a lot of people who have not engaged in those kinds of milestones that were identified kind of decades ago? And even though I have hit many of these milestones in my own life, it was very interesting to hear about what she's saying about this generation, which technically I'm a part of this generation of 30-somethings, and how she describes kind of the work lives. And what was really interesting about this particular book is she gives a lot of examples of stories of people who are in their 30s trying to get into like a long-term relationship, trying to build their career, trying to get to be more financially stable. And she follows these stories throughout the book, and you get to see kind of how they resolve, which I always enjoy, kind of an anthropological approach to this kind of storytelling. It's kind of a combination of theory and scholarship, but also the actual stories of people's real lives. So again, that was But You're Still So Young by Kayleen Shaver. Then I picked up The Nest by Cynthia Sweeney. And this is a book that I just heard a ton about, but I didn't really know much about it. I did listen to it on audio. Basically, it's a book about a bunch of adults who are siblings, and they're coming back together because they had been promised, or they had kind of assumed that they would get some kind of inheritance. And then one of the siblings puts that inheritance under threat. And it's not clear that they're all going to get this kind of windfall of cash that they had all planned for. And you get to see the dynamics of these siblings kind of engaging with each other, and also hear their life stories of like what has brought them to this moment where they kind of thought they needed this cash, and what are they going to do if they don't get it. Definitely a group of people who are coming from wealth and kind of trying to grapple with the fact that they may not have it in the same way that they thought they were going to. So I always like a book, fiction novels that have a bunch of siblings and kind of their complicated lives. So I enjoyed it from that perspective of just having the relationships be dissected so that we could kind of understand what they're trying to do with this problem that they've been presented with. Next, I read a book called Box 88 by Charles Cumming, and I had never read this author before. This is basically a spy novel, and not my typical read, but I saw it at the library and like the cover was just intriguing to me, and so I picked it up, I read the flap, and decided to grab it. I ended up listening to this on audio, and I had the hard copy from the library as well. I really enjoyed the audio. I thought it had a lot of really interesting kind of spy elements, and I guess if you're like a connoisseur of spy novels, this might not have been super exciting, but for me, because I don't read them very often, there was enough in there to kind of keep me engaged, and it was new to me because there were different things that were discussed about spy culture that I just didn't know anything about. So I found it to be really interesting. This is the first book in a series with the main character, I think. And so I'm actually really looking forward to maybe picking up the next one. Okay, then I dove into House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This is a series, it's the Crescent City series that everyone talks about. This is why I was like, I need to pick this up. I need to understand what this is all about. And it's long. I mean, the first book I think is at least 800 pages. The second book, similar. And this came on my radar most recently because the second book just came out in this series. And so I was like, well, maybe I should pick this up. Let me see what everybody's talking about. I've never read a Sarah J. Maas before. She has other series that I may dip into at some point. I listened to this book on audio. I also had the Kindle copy of it. And I will say I felt really lost for maybe the first 300 pages of this book, to the point where I almost went back and listened to it again because I felt like I was not getting the full picture of what everybody was like raving about. So I ended up going online, as I have done in the past, and I found a synopsis just to make sure that I was like picking up what I thought I was supposed to pick up. And I was, like, there wasn't anything really in depth that I wasn't getting, but this is definitely a world building series. It's the story of a woman who lives in this world where there's different kinds of creatures. Like there's people who are more like wolves, there's people who are fae, and basically she has a best friend who is murdered along with like another group of her friends, and she is engaging in trying to solve the mystery of what happened. But in the midst of all of this, there are these like layers within this culture of like different hierarchies. There are different, groups of creatures that you're coming to understand and get to know. There are angels, there are, all different kinds of people. And it's set in basically contemporary times, but it has these layers of these different cultures within the book. I don't even know if you'd call them cultures, but populations of people or creatures. You can see it's challenging for me to describe, even more challenging for me to understand as I was reading it. So I decided to not reread those 300 pages because I had already given quite a bit of time to this book, but I just kept going. And I will say after that point, I got sucked in. Like I was really engaged. I wanted to know what happened to these characters. I felt like I kind of hit a stride a little bit and I knew what was happening. And to the point where the ending was very satisfying. You know, I felt like I knew what was going on. So I'm definitely going to pick up the second book, but I feel like this is one of those ones where you do have to kind of give it some attention to feel like you understand what's happening. And I was glad that I did. And I'm interested in kind of continuing on with this series, but it's an investment. Okay, after that, I picked up another nonfiction book called Creative Directions by Jason Sperling. And this is basically a collection of different essays and pieces of wisdom from people who were at one point in their careers a creative, but then they moved into management. And I love books like this. I love when people are sharing their lessons learned from different experiences that they've had. And I was familiar with some of the people who were in this book, like who were quoted in this book. But basically it breaks the chapters down into different themes. And then there's like maybe a dozen different people who comment on that theme and have like a quote where they tell a story or they explain, you know, what their lesson is learned in that area. So this is everything from like how to handle difficult people to how to give up the idea that you're the one doing the creating and how do you like nurture other people who are doing the creating. And I had come across this book a while ago and had just wanted to see what it was all about. And so I really enjoyed it. I really enjoy reading books on like management, leadership from different fields. And so this would definitely fall into that category. All right, then I picked up The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. And this is a book that I actually started a couple months ago, and then I had to return it to the library and I couldn't get through it fast enough. So I ended up picking it up on audio so that I could listen to it. And I think I had the ebook as well that I could look at. This is a book that a lot of people have very strong feelings about. They really like it. I thought it was okay. I wasn't like completely blown away by it. The general premise and idea of this book is that you have a woman who kind of makes a deal with the devil, and the deal with the devil is she can meet people, but they will never remember her. And so she lives she basically has like hundreds of years of her life. Like she has, this is part of what she traded, is that like she gets to live for a long period of time, but that no one ever remembers her. So you start the book and she's kind of in a series of relationships with people who it's like one night stands for them because they never remember her. And then at one point she goes into a bookstore and she meets this man and he does remember her. And it's like shocking because this hasn't happened for like 300 years and they don't really understand why. And so part of the story is to try to understand why, like what is it about this relationship in particular that's different. I thought this book was very clever. I liked how it was written. I wouldn't say that it's like one of my top 10 favorite books of all time, which like some people feel that way about this book, but I definitely feel like it's solid and interesting. And it was, you know, an interesting plot that was kind of innovative in terms of what the storyline was doing. So would definitely recommend it. Then I picked up, as part of my alphabet challenge, this was one of my end books, Never Saw Me Coming by Vera Kurian. And this book is about psychopaths, which I don't know what it says about me, but I enjoy this kind of topic. I think it's really interesting. It's a novel, it's not nonfiction, but it's basically a book about a bunch of psychopaths who are in college together and they're part of a study where their actions are being studied because they've been identified as being psychopaths. But for the most part, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, for the most part, they are nonviolent. And this professor is kind of doing a study on them being psychopaths. But one of them gets killed, and then it kind of throws the characters into this kind of chaos where they don't understand what's happening. They think others of them might be getting targeted. They're not sure why. They can't trust each other because they're all psychopaths and they lie and have these other kind of personality characteristics that don't lend themselves toward trusting relationships. And it kind of goes on from there. I did not see the ending coming. I didn't feel like it was like 100% satisfying, but it was fine. I mostly enjoyed the parts of this book where the psychopaths are interacting with each other and you have to kind of think from that perspective because you know that unless you are a psychopath as you are watching this, but most of us are not, this is not how we think. This is not how our brains work. And so it kind of puts you into that perspective of trying to understand how would you be interacting with a psychopath as a psychopath, which I just find really fascinating. I also listened to that on audio, so I can recommend it in that medium. The next book I listened to, also on audio, is called Wish You Were Here by Jodi Picoult. I have read, I think, almost every Jodi Picoult book that has been published. One of them is actually in my dissertation, in my first book. I talk about it. And so I have been a fan of Jodi Picoult for a very long time. I really love the amount of research that she puts into her books. They're usually like family dramas or some kind of like literary drama where she's picking often a topic that's kind of ripped from the headlines and then doing a deeper dive on it. I've read a couple of her books, I think even this year, and I was looking into her backlist over the past like 6 to 8 months because I'd kind of not revisited her for a while, and so she'd published a bunch of things that I hadn't been caught up with. So this is her most recent book. It is about the pandemic. It is about COVID specifically, and basically it's the story of a woman who is, I think she's engaged or she's in a serious relationship, and she's going to go on a vacation with this person who's her partner. And it's right before COVID hits. He works in a hospital, COVID hits, he can't go, she goes on this vacation and has kind of this experience that's life-changing for her. And then we see kind of what happens from there. I would say this book is highly triggering. If you are having any issues around COVID, or if you do not want to engage in a narrative about this particular pandemic. If you've been watching these debrief videos, you know I've been reading a lot of pandemic literature this year. I read The Stand. I've read some John Scalzi books about a pandemic, but it's not about COVID specifically. And I think that this one was close enough, you know, to COVID and to the experience that many of us have just had, that I would just be careful. Like I want to give a definite trigger warning for that, in a different way than what I would say about these other pandemic books that feel farther away from our experience. So all that said, I enjoyed it. I thought it had an interesting kind of twist, which Jodi Picoult's books usually do. There's some kind of interesting twist. But I might start, if you've never read a Jodi Picoult, maybe start with another book of hers just to kind of ease yourself into the kind of stuff that she writes, see if you like it, and then eventually work your way toward this, maybe when you have a little bit more distance from the pandemic. I'm not surprised that she picked this topic. I think she handles it really well. And I felt fine reading it, but I can imagine there's a lot of people who would find it really challenging. All right, then I picked up Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is a doorstopper. It's 1,000 pages long. I did listen to it on audio. I actually think I would have had kind of a challenge of getting through it if I had not listened to it on audio. It's very Dickensian, if you've ever read Charles Dickens, highly descriptive, set in the past, so it's kind of a historical fiction, and it's basically about like the history of magic in England, in the UK. I really, really liked it. It's got great ambiance. I love how the story builds. Whenever I read a book that's like 1,000 pages long, I always think to myself, could this have been a trilogy? Like, did this really have to be 1,000 pages long? I do feel like for this book and what she's trying to do, it makes sense for this to be 1,000 pages. But I really needed the audio. Like, I think I would have had a hard time sticking with it if I had just tried to read it. And it's just kind of a slog to get through 1,000 pages. And if I'm trying to do that in addition to 21 other books in a month, I need the audio, and I need the audio to be sped up. So I did choose to do that. This is actually a book that I would totally read again. Like there are books that have this kind of, I don't know, quality to them where they are rereadable, and part of it's the length. I think you're going to pick up different things every time. But I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was really fun. Okay, then I read 1 Degree Revolution by Kobe Kozlowski. And this is a book about yoga. And I think I mentioned in my TBR video for April, I happen to be a certified yoga teacher. I don't actively teach yoga right now just because my job is pretty demanding and I don't have a lot of time. But sometimes I teach yoga with individual coaching clients that I work with outside of my day job. And I like to keep up a regular yoga practice. And so I like to incorporate reading about yoga into part of that practice. One of the things I really enjoyed about this book is it does a nice job of talking about yoga as more than just the physical practice of yoga. If you're familiar with asana as a practice, which is basically the physical poses of yoga, there's actually a lot of other components that are part of yoga, but we sometimes only know about the physical practice. And so if you have an interest in yoga in general, like you want to learn more about it beyond the physical practice, this would be a great book to pick up. I thought it was really approachable. I thought it did a great job of incorporating examples and like talking through different elements of yoga that you probably wouldn't hear about unless you read a book about it or you were in some kind of yoga teacher training. So interesting for you to pick up if you want to learn more about that. Then I picked up 9 Perfect Strangers by Liane Moriarty. I remember reading my first Liane Moriarty maybe 10 years ago. It was I think it was The Husband's Secret that I picked up and really, really enjoyed it. This is also kind of suburban drama. And you know how I love suburban drama. If you've watched any of my other videos, this is a genre that I frequently pick up. But this is a story that I also wanted to pick up because it was recently adapted into, I think, a television show on Hulu. And I wanted to read the book before I watched it. And it's basically about 9 people who go to a retreat center for various different reasons that they engage in this retreat. And while they're there, the retreat leader kind of takes them on this very interesting journey. And I don't want to give too much away here, but it is a life-changing experience for many of them. We do come to understand the backstories of why they entered into this retreat space and why they all come there. What is their kind of motivation? And it definitely is a little bit, it gets silly towards the end. It goes into a territory it's not magical realism, but it's definitely stretching the boundaries of kind of, you have to kind of just go with the story and kind of see where it lands. I think it's actually a great story to adapt into a TV show, so I'm excited to watch the adaptation because I think it's probably pretty good. All right, then I read a book that I wasn't planning to read. So as part of my Alphabet Challenge, I had a book on my list called Nurse Come You Here by Mary McLeod. And this is a book about a woman who is a country nurse on a Scottish isle. Well, it turned out that book was the second in a series, and I am not great about reading a second book without reading the first book. I really like to read these things in order, and I'm really glad I did. So the first book in the series is called Call the Nurse, True Stories of a Country Nurse on a Scottish Isle, and then the second one, Nurse Come You Here. So I read Call the Nurse first. This is basically a set of stories about this woman who in the 70s moves with her family to a very remote Scottish island, and she is the nurse of this region. And there are really crazy stories of what she is kind of dealing with in this remote setting. It's hard to even describe. I mean, it's like some of these stories you would just think like, that can't be real. Like that can't necessarily have happened. Like one, and I can't remember which book each of these stories is in, but there's one story, for example, of a woman who is basically held captive by her family members in a home for like 20 years and nobody knew. And then we find out why, and we kind of understand what happens to this woman. And she kind of tells the story over several different chapters. I mean, that's just one example of kind of these very strange things that she encounters in her real life when she is a nurse. So I liked the first one enough to pick up the second one. I mean, I wanted to read these stories. I feel like they're coming out of a life experience that is very different from anything that I would ever experience. And I just found it to be really fascinating. So I would recommend both of those books if they're interesting to you. Then I read the next book in the Louise Penny series. This is book number 6 called Bury Your Dead. I think this is probably my favorite book in this series so far. It takes place out of the town of Three Pines, which is where these books are normally set, where Gamage, who's the main detective, has been kind of called away to do like a research project, and something has happened before this research project takes place, and we're getting flashbacks of a particular situation. And so the story is kind of flashing back to this situation and then flashing forward to where Gamage is right now, where a crime has taken place. There is a murder. He's trying to help solve it. And this is taking place in Montreal. So he's out of the small town. He's in a bigger city. He's interacting with the police that are in that city, trying to help solve this crime. I feel like the way that this was told was really masterful. I think that we're starting to see Louise Penny really hit her stride with this book. The last one was also very good because, as I mentioned in last one's video, she kind of takes a risk with one of the characters that I thought was really interesting. We get that kind of resolution about that situation in this book. So there's several things that she's kind of juggling in this particular narrative that I think are just incredibly well done. I also listened to this one on audio. I highly recommend the narrator of this series on audio. It's really, really good. Okay, so there are four more books that I read in this month in pretty quick succession. So the first book is of these four is The Bright Side Running Club by Josie Lloyd. And this is a book about a woman who has a breast cancer diagnosis and joins a running club as part of her coping strategy when she's going through treatment. It is very much a book about female friendship and women kind of supporting other women. Now, I will say that the main character has a situation that she's engaging in around her job, she has a business where she's very passive, and it made me a little bit crazy. I think it was supposed to make me crazy as a reader that she is like not resolving or taking care of this thing that is like continually getting worse. And we just see her kind of stepping back from it and dealing with the cancer diagnosis. And the cancer diagnosis becomes kind of this excuse for why she can't deal with this other thing. Of course, it all gets resolved at the end of this book. It is that kind of book where everything gets kind of tied up in the end. But those were the most kind of frustrating moments of this book for me, where I was like, why are you just not dealing with this? Like, it didn't really make a ton of sense, despite the cancer diagnosis that she's dealing with. The author of this book did have breast cancer, and she talks about that at the end of the book. So it's very clearly like a realistic depiction of what this is. I would obviously give a trigger warning if breast cancer is a trigger for you. But I really actually ended up enjoying this book a lot, setting aside the thing that was kind of making me crazy. I loved the depiction of female friendship. I really enjoyed the different female characters and how they were living very different lives from each other, but coming together around this idea that they all had this diagnosis and they were then supporting each other in different ways. Next up, I read a book called How to Have a Good Day by Caroline Webb. This was a book that I would definitely recommend. I thought it's a really nice collection of the science around productivity and how you can improve your attitude and or your experience in a typical day through different routines and strategies that you might use. There was a lot in here that it kind of reminded me, if you've ever read Atomic Habits, which I also find to be kind of a canonical or foundational book about habits. This book was very similar to that. It tells really helpful stories about the steps and the strategies. And I felt like it was very digestible. I did read this book in hard copy. I didn't have it any other way. And I found it really easy to like dip in and out of. And there were some takeaways that I took away from this book that I would apply, to my work life. So if you're looking for something like that, something around like productivity, some of the productivity books I've read this year, and I know that I talked about one in the past, it was all stuff that I kind of heard before. This one is a nice combination of science and scholarship and actual examples. And I felt like it did a nice job of offering these things in an order in which it made sense. So there was some stuff about like relationships. There was other stuff about resilience. I think I found the resilience chapter to be the most effective of the entire book. It kind of comes towards the end, but would definitely recommend this one too. All right, a couple more. So one of these got swapped out for something else on my list. So I had a book on my list that was the next book in the Wheel of Time series. And by the end of the month, I just did not have time. I had it on audio. It was going to take like 16 hours and I did not have those 16 hours. So I'm moving that book to next month. You can check out the May TBR video coming soon. But I ended up swapping it out for the second book in the Finlay Donovan series, which is Finlay Donovan Knocks 'Em Dead. So I had read this series by El Casimano. I started it earlier this year. Loved the first book, highly recommended it to a bunch of different people that I know. It's kind of this humorous mystery, and that is not typically the genre of mystery that I read. And so I really, really enjoyed it, and I just found it to be fun. The second book continues in the same vein. I think that the first book for me, because it was such a different book than I normally read, I enjoyed the first book more because I was just kind of like caught off guard by it. Like I didn't know what to expect. And so I really, really enjoyed it. The second book has the same characters, kind of this plot where the main character is like getting herself into trouble in all of these ways that you're like, how is she going to get herself out of this? So I did find it to be really enjoyable. Listen to it on audio. Highly recommend the audio narrator for this one as well. And I'll just say quickly that the general plot of this, if you did not watch an earlier video about the first Finlay Donovan book, is you have a suburban mother who's a writer and she gets mistaken for being a hit woman. That plot continues in book 2. So she is still being mistaken for being a hit woman, and she's gotten pulled into all this stuff that she's having to kind of untangle herself from in the second book. All right, the last book that I read, my 22nd book of the month, was No Exit by Taylor Adams. Now, this was the last book in my alphabet challenge for the month. And I was really looking forward to this because I've read another Taylor Adams before, and she is kind of like a twisty thriller, like turn the pages. Like if you were going to be looking for a book to like read on an airplane, this is a great one because it's like relatively short chapters. You're just kind of like flipping through. And I had this on ebook, and I was able to pick it up and almost read it in one sitting because it's relatively short. I think it's under 300 pages. And the general premise of it is you have a girl who is a college student, and she goes to she's traveling home. She's just found out some kind of bad news about her family, and she's traveling home, I think over the holidays. And she stops at a rest stop. It's blizzarding, it's snowy, and she has to stop and pull off because it's just not safe for her to drive. The highway's closing. And she gets to this rest stop. There's a number of people there. And when she's out in the parking lot, she kind of somehow finds out, she looks in this van, and there is a child in a cage in this van. And obviously not a good thing for a child to be in a cage. And so, but she doesn't know who the owner of this van is, of who is at the rest stop, because there's several different people it could be. And so we find out relatively quickly who the owner is of the van. So this is not like the whole book is her trying to figure that out. It's her trying to figure that out. She figures it out. And then she's in this kind of like war or battle with this person who's the owner of the van, who is trying to get away with this like kidnapping. And she is trying to stop them. I think this book is great. I mean, people love this book. It was also adapted, I think, into a movie on Hulu. I don't know that I'm going to watch the movie because it's kind of more in the horror genre. The book is a lot more palatable to me because it's just a thriller and it's not more horror, whereas I think the movie is meant to be more horror. But I found this to be very fun in terms of just like the twists. Like there's stuff that you're not expecting, and then all of a sudden like there's this reveal and it changes the whole plot, and then like there's another reveal and it changes it again. I mean, there was just like all these kinds of things that were very twisty about this plot that kept me engaged. You definitely have to suspend belief on this. Like all of these things are not going to happen to one person in a rest stop, you know, like, I mean, there's just, you have to kind of let that go like you would with many books in this genre. But I actually thought it was great. I would definitely recommend it if you're looking for something that's like trying to get out of a reading slump, or if you have, you know, a period of time that you're going to be bored, you know, like you have to wait for like your car to get, fixed at the mechanics or something like that. Like this would be a great book to sit with and to spend your time on. So those are the 22 books that I read in the month of April, and I'm really looking forward to picking out the books that I'm going to be reading in May. So stay tuned, and I'll be posting that video soon. You can see the next 22 books that are going to be on my list. Thanks for watching.